Welcome once again to the Scrum's webcast, viewers and listeners. Thank you for tuning in. This afternoon, I'll be talking to James Carden, our distinguished Russianist. Um, and our topic is paradoxically at one and the same time rather narrow and more or less infinite. I can't decide which. We want to take up the question of HMS Defender wandering into Russian waters earlier this week, and why so reckless an exercise was undertaken. I'm all for putting this in a larger context and understanding what is going on right now between the West and Russia. And maybe James wants to make it more particular between the United between the Anglosphere and Russia, right? Um, so why don't I begin by asking you, James, what's your take on the rather narrow topic of the Defender and why in hell it was there?
Well, it seems still to be somewhat unclear what exactly happened. You have two different stories coming from the British and from the Russians. It seems to me that the particulars of the event are not particularly important. The British said that they were there to show support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. In other words, in order to send a message to the Russians that they in the West don't view the annexation of Crimea, which occurred in the spring of 2014, to be legitimate. Exercises like this are dangerous because we really don't know that much about the dynamics of escalation in wartime, and so these things can quickly get out of hand. Apparently, the Russians were conducting live fire exercises very close to where the British ship was in the Black Sea, and it doesn't take a great leap of imagination to imagine that something really bad could have happened. The problem with sending these messages is that it would inevitably, if something did happen, it would inevitably drag the United States and the rest of NATO into a confrontation with Russia, which is something that we should not want, considering the fact that the United States and Russia have roughly 1,350 strategic nuclear weapons pointed at one another. That would be an end of civilization event if we got to that point, right? So I don't think anyone, even perhaps no, I don't think any sane person would think that Crimea is worth the ball game there.
Same person rather narrows the population a little bit.
Right. I mean, there are certain elements within our own government, and certainly in Kiev, who would risk atomic annihilation for not only Crimea but for the little sliver of Donbass, which Russia sort of controls. So that's a problem. And the other problem is that these kinds of shows of support encourage the Ukrainians in this sort of fantasy that someday the annexation is going to be reversed. It is not. And as my colleague Anatol Levin has written in a very, very good piece in Responsible Statecraft, this is very similar to what happened in 2008 when the neoconservatives on Capitol Hill kept egging on the Georgians, particularly their very foolish leader, Mikhail Saakashvili, into starting a shooting war with Russia over South Ossetia. So we shouldn't be encouraging the Ukrainians in their delusion that the United States, NATO, are going to go to war for them against the Russians. It's not going to happen, in spite of a lot of people, unfortunately, in the Biden administration who would probably like that. So it encourages bad behavior. It's risky and it's pointless because the Russians are never, ever, ever going to give up control of Crimea, which wasn't really Ukrainian in the first place.
Yeah.
And we can get into that a little bit later.
Yeah. I mean, Anatol did apart from the responsible statecraft thing, did a very long paper for Quincy itself. I was privileged to edit it, right? And he said some of these things and expanded on them very intelligently. How do we get out of this situation? And point one is, let's stop fantasizing about what is going to happen in Crimea. It's like saying, someday if the Russians are persistent, someday we'll surrender Norfolk, Virginia, or something, right? Or San Diego. They're preposterous, right? Now, we have what we have by way of hard information about what happened. Often the case. But in the line of surmise, we have what transpired aboard the Defender prior to this encounter. The British were contracting with Ukraine from what I know, a rather extensive contract to build port facilities along Ukraine's coast with on the Black Sea, ex-Crimea, right? And I think to supply some warships that the Royal Navy doesn't give a shit about anymore, apparently, right? So here you have them in Ukraine, right? Fast pilot boats or something like that, right? What do you and a minor detail, but rather curious. The Defender had a BBC correspondent on board. Why, right? It suggests to me they were really hoping for a dangerous confrontation, right? How do you read this sort of stuff, James?
Well, it's sort of
Meaning it's purposeful,
it's sort of not atypical British hubris. They still seem to think of themselves in the front rank of world powers, when the fact of the matter is that militarily they don't really matter very much. France has a much stronger military. I would say Italy probably has a much stronger military than the UK. So it was extremely foolish of them to go nose to nose with a country that is exponentially stronger militarily than they are. So they still suffer, and large numbers of Americans, particularly neoconservatives, suffer from these Churchillian delusions. If you look at the numbers, it's preposterous. So in terms of active duty and reserve personnel, Russia has something on the order of 3.4 million members, active duty members. The UK has barely over 200,000. The numbers in terms of, tanks, similar gap. Russia has over 20,000 tanks. The UK has 250. If you look at aircraft, the Russians have, 3,800 roughly. The UK has 850, 860. So, there's an enormous mismatch there. Now, the mismatch gets smaller if you include all of the NATO membership's firepower compared to Russia. But the problem is that this is Russia's immediate neighborhood, and the strongest NATO member happens to be separated from Europe by the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a point that Colonel Doug McGregor makes all the time, is that the United States and NATO cannot win a shooting war with Russia in Eastern Europe. That's just a fact. And so I think it was, extremely foolish, extremely hubristic, what the UK was trying to do. But of course, they're egged on by our own defense establishment, and no doubt by the NATO bureaucracy in Brussels.
I want to go into the larger implications here, but before we sort of dolly out, let's dolly in a little bit, and talk about Crimea specifically. The game of pretend in the American press is that Russia annexed, or maybe re-annexed, Crimea out of the clear blue in spring of 2014. No explanation offered, but it was plain. It was plain at the time, one, that the American cultivated coup in Kiev, February 14. The prize there was Crimea and Sevastopol, precisely, right? And I don't think that it looks to me as if the Americans and the English have never really let up, have never really surrendered that objective, right? Maybe you can talk about the status of Crimea historically, going back to pre-Khrushchev and what it was in history, right? And then what Khrushchev did in '54 and the implications there, right?
Right. So Crimea has always been heavily ethnically Russian, and the two key dates I think people need to keep in mind when we're talking about Crimea is 1954 and December 1991. So in 1954, as you alluded to, Khrushchev kind of gifted the Crimean Peninsula over to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. But he was gifting it to a part of the country that was part of the country, right? So he wasn't gifting it across international borders.
He wasn't surrendering Soviet sovereignty.
Right.
It was an administrative gesture sort of thing, right?
Yeah, and it has always played an enormous part in Soviet, then Russian national security, because it's a warm water port. So they've always had a naval base in Sevastopol. Now, what people forget, when Khrushchev made the gift, Sevastopol wasn't included.
Oh, it was.
No, it was always a Russian administrative district.
Oh, like an enclave or something. Yeah. I didn't know that.
The other key date, fast forward some decades to the end of the Cold War, is December 1991. And so the USSR in American and British mythology is that Thatcher and Reagan spent the USSR into bankruptcy. They couldn't keep up with our, defense programs, Star Wars and the like. And so basically our two heroes, bankrupted the Soviet Union, and it had to dissolve. But that isn't exactly what happened. In 1991, the three leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine met in a small forest town outside of Minsk, and they consciously dissolved the Union Treaty. So in a way, it was an internal coup. There was no reason other than that for why the USSR collapsed. During those meetings, and Boris Yeltsin, who was the leader of the Russian Republic, was being Boris Yeltsin. In other words, he was probably drunk and quite out to lunch. And the leader of the Ukrainian Republic, Leonid Kravchuk, told Yeltsin that we're going to keep some form of the union, right? We'll have invisible borders, was the term that he used. So the Russians felt then reassured that some form of the union would remain, and there was no reason then to address the issue of Crimea. Of course, Kravchuk went back on his word, and that was the ballgame. And from then on, the Crimea was part of Ukraine, but with an enormously big Russian majority population there. So this has always been a point of contention, a point of unease between the two countries, and indeed between the West and Russia. Around that same time, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine began making noises about how the Russians really should give up Sevastopol. So this has been going on for 30 years. This effort, by the United States to wrench Ukraine and Sevastopol out of Russia's orbit. So this is nothing new. Of course, it came to a head in 2014. So that's kind of a thumbnail history.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, James. I tend to see the Defender incident, narrow as it is on its own terms, so to say, in a much larger context, and that is to pose the question: what does the West want out of Russia, and what sort of relations do they want? It seems to me, if you go back over recent history, the Ukraine crisis of this past spring, when Russia amassed a huge number of troops and materiel on the border, Biden's Pentagon sent 2 warships through the Bosporus, having obtained Turkey's assent, and then reversed. They were halfway through the Bosporus, as far as I understand, and they turned around, right? I think that's when it started to shape up as a Georgia replay, right? A Georgia 2008 replay. So I start to conclude that, first of all, James, I have to say, you're no doubt right that the Brits entertain delusions of grandeur as to their place in the world. In my view, every British prime minister is afflicted with a Churchill complex, just as most French presidents, not all of them, have a de Gaulle complex, right? I'm sure you're right about that.
I think one is much preferable to the other, but
I actually have a lot of time for de Gaulle in many respects. So anyway, and it's fun watching movies about Churchill. I don't know what I think of him, but these stirring dramas about what a grand man he was. Anyway, but setting that aside, I read British foreign policy now, and in this context, military policy, as nothing more than a reflection of what Washington wants, right? The Anglosphere comes up, right? The English-speaking peoples, as Churchill used to put it, right? So what Britain does is what America wants, right? So what does America want? And my conclusion is, it's a long way for a drink of water here, but my conclusion is that I don't think America wants a peaceable relationship with Russia. I simply don't. I think it wants a dangerous relationship with Russia. James Carden's view.
well, I think that you're probably right. You can't possibly look at American policy at least since 20, at least since 2012. So I actually think that Obama and his attempted reset when Putin was prime minister and he had another president to deal with, um, I think he was sincere. I think that that was a good faith effort. And I saw a lot of evidence that it was a good faith effort. The problem is that the American government and American elites feel that they have the right and duty to choose the leaders of other countries. So when Putin decided that he was going to come back for a third term, that's when everything went south.
Oh, really?
That was something that our foreign policy establishment could not abide by.
There was a real there was a real sort of break in the thinking in Washington at that moment. I didn't know that.
That's my view. I mean, that's what I witnessed, is that was sort of the point. Putin's speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, where he basically declared that his country was going to chart an independent course. That was big. But then when he decided to come back, because certain people, like Michael McFaul, and I believe Joe Biden at the time, didn't foresee that Putin would come back for a third term. A lot of the Obama people actually thought that Medvedev was going to be the new guy that they were going to deal with for some time. So there was some shock in those circles. Now, I think that that's pretty silly that they were surprised, but their reaction was even sillier, and it was actually very dangerous. It was an overreaction that, in large part, is responsible for the situation that we now find ourselves in. So I think it's very Putin-centric. I think that the American foreign policy establishment cannot and will not work with him. Now, if he disappears from the scene, it wouldn't surprise me if there was another attempt to try to normalize relations. But I don't foresee that happening as long as he's there.
Yeah. I think that the reverse is true too. My take on this whole thing, the beginning of, I mean, the recent, in terms of recent events, I start with that extraordinary week when Biden called Putin a killer, and Blinken made a mess in Alaska. I think both China and Russia concluded in reverse just what you said. You can't work with these people, right? They're not serious. And I see the attitude changing a lot, since then. I think they're going to be increasingly insistent on observance of international law and turning American criticisms of Russia and, of course, China back on them. Bit of imminent critique, right? But when we talk about when we talk about what Americans want there, and I suppose you agree with me, we don't want Biden's term is strategic stability. I'm not even sure he wants that, right? But in any case, if the Biden administration, and by extension, the English-speaking peoples across the way, right, want a constantly disturbed relationship, it's going to divide Europe, right? I think it already is, right? Core Europe, right? There were two headlines this morning, one in Politico. Europe is against better relations with Russia, right? I think I emailed you that piece. That may not be the exact head, right? And then there's one came up in my email from Telesur, Europe is divided on the Russia question, right? And even divided is a bit generous because core Europe, the Franco-German axis, uh, are very out front. Macron being the most vociferous, but Merkel in a more measured way, looking for a redo with Russia, right? And when they talk about divided Europe, they're talking about Poland and the Baltic states. Conventional wisdom in American discourse is if you want to know what to think about Russia, talk to them. They know, they've lived under the Soviets and so on and so forth. My feeling is exactly the opposite. If you want a good, sound opinion of Russia, don't ask them. They're paranoids, right? So, in my view, here's the question. If America insists on this posture toward Russia, it's going to divide the Europeans eventually. We're really asking for trouble. And it will be a major element in what I think is inevitable as long as the Americans carry on the way they do with America's isolation. Right? We're going to isolate ourselves increasingly. Right? And we'll have friends like the Ukrainian, the Nazi beset Ukrainians. They'll be our friends. Right?
Well, yeah, I think, to some extent we're seeing that already. I mean, it was kind of astonishing how quickly so this unfolded. So only 3 days ago, on the 23rd, the Financial Times was reporting that Macron and Merkel wanted to make an overture to Putin and meet with him. And in a matter of days, the group that you just mentioned, the Poles, the Baltics, no doubt the UK, at the urging of the United States, had scuttled the idea of the EU, meeting with Putin. So it's become, it's become a crime even to pursue diplomacy.
Yeah.
Well, that's very foolish. And I absolutely agree with you in terms of your estimation of, the influence of Poland and the Baltics is rather outsized.
Jeez.
And really, Macron and Merkel are acting as responsible stewards.
Yeah, I agree.
And and it seems as though that her designated successor, Armin Laschet, who may, who has her party's nomination and who may succeed her in September, is very much it thinks the same way, right? So the real danger is if the German Green Party takes power. The German Green Party they're very much like our own progressives now. It's the party of war and wokeism. So they're cultural imperialists of the worst kind. So it would be a very bad thing for the prospects of peaceable settlement in Europe if the Green Party got the chancery in September. It doesn't look like they will right now. They've slipped considerably in the polls.
Yeah. I'm sure they all subscribe to the Intercept in the Nation, the German Greens.
Well, someone has to.
A good riposte. Anyway, where from here? We have various accounts of what happened, but the Russians are on the record now, James, saying next time we're going to shoot.
Yeah.
And we're and next time we are going to bomb and we are going to shoot. I approve. We have to draw a line under this shit,
Well, again, you wouldn't want anything to risk the kind of, escalation into a full blown.
I entirely agree, but who's imposing the risk, right?
Well, no, that's right. The other thing that, I failed to mention is that, within hours after Macron and Merkel floated the idea of, setting up a European summit with Putin, Moscow was very receptive to it.
Interesting. Interesting.
And I think that, the timing of the whole HMS Defender incident somewhat, is also somewhat suspect.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I hope that, Merkel is on her way out, and I'm not a particularly big fan of hers, though she definitely, during the height of the Ukrainian crisis in 14-15, she definitely put the brakes on any grand plans to
Yeah.
arm them.
Yeah. I want to
arm-
mention something here, James.
She's been terrible on economics for
Yeah.
the continent. But I hope Macron keeps on keeping on
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
in his gaulless pursuit of détente with Russia. And even if he gets deposed, and I don't think he will, but even if he gets deposed by the far right lady, uh, she will pursue a similar policy.
Yeah.
And I would rather, sorry to say, I'd rather National Rally win in France than the Greens in Germany.
Rock and roll, James. Anyway, I want to mention to you something that you'll remember. I'm certain maybe a lot of listeners will have a little trouble dredging this one up. I guess it was around 2015, somewhere in 2015, Minsk was being negotiated. And it became quite clear that the Americans were going to try to scuttle it, right? And I think Obama sent Biden over. His itinerary was Kiev, Moscow, right, to kind of snuff out the flame, right? I remember very distinctly. It was a Tuesday. Merkel called Macron and said, "Buy a plane ticket. We're going to Kiev, and then we're going to Moscow." Or maybe they just went straight to Moscow, but they acted autonomously in an urgent situation. And I recall it because in their confrontation with the European Union in general, uh, I sort of looked to them, that's core Europe. I mean, if you had to choose two countries to stand behind among all 27 or 8 members, those are the strongest. So maybe they can pull this out. You have a thought on that? Do you remember that incident I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do. And I also remember being quite relieved when the Minsk group was formed, that there was one country that was excluded from it. And I was quite
Yeah,
relieved.
they didn't want the Americans. No, thank you.
And whenever I hear, you heard this sometimes during the Trump administration, that the U.S. should join the Minsk group. I always kind of cringe. I don't think that that's a recipe for success.
No, no. In Anatol's paper, he wants the Americans to take a leading role in reviving Minsk and so on and so forth. I don't really see it. I mean, that's not where the sentiment is.
That's that would be a rare area of disagreement I have with the great Anatol.
Yeah, I have a lot of time for him too. I'm right with you.
Yeah. No, I hope we don't. And yeah. So anyway, dangerous times.
Yeah.
And it continues. And we seem to be, unfortunately, the Anglo-American world seems like we're sleepwalking to disaster.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
a strange twist of history, it's the Germans who just might save us from ourselves.
Yeah, truly, truly. It's bitter to say these sorts of things, but I'm rather pleased to see the West dividing, right?
On this, certainly.
The monolithic West dividing. Given America's role I mean, Ukraine is one example, of course, right, of numerous. Given America's very destructive role in the global disorder, um, the more isolated we are, I also think the better off, right? Because there's going to have to be some bitterness before we're able to draw a line under American misconduct, you know.
Well, in a for the Scrum, I think a few weeks ago, I put forward the idea that isolationism is kind of an attractive
Oh,
option for
yeah,
us now because we don't have a responsible political elite in this country. And so
right.
um, and unfortunately, we've seen with a lot of the appointments that Biden is stacking his State Department and his Pentagon and his National Security Council with the worst kinds of neocons. The only difference between a lot of the neocons that Trump appointed is that these people affiliate with the Democratic Party.
Yeah,
But some of the more recent appointments are really quite alarming. And he sort of pushed back on people like Wendy Sherman, Victoria Nuland, and his own Secretary of State when they wanted to double down on the sanctions with regard to Nord Stream. So when he's there, uh, he
how delicately put.
he he has the ability to do the right thing. I fear that that won't be for long, and
Yeah,
I think should he not, you know, um, fill out his term to completion, we're going to be in a real bind
yeah.
because because Dan Quayle in a pantsuit is not um, is not the ticket, and so
You're having fun down there, I can see.
she'll do whatever she's told.
Yeah, she's no original thinking there.
How
But
to,
you were talking in that very good piece. You were talking, I'll coin the phrase, active isolationism, right? Thought through isolationism. The other kind is imposed isolationism, a kind of implicit repudiation on the part of the rest of the Western powers, right? We'll have to see what. I think it's going to come down to the latter, actually, but and the significance of Russian and Chinese conduct since Anchorage and he's a killer is that they're just. I think that moment was rather key. It was at that point you could see quite visibly if you studied uh, the the diplomatic itinerary of Wang Yi and Lavrov and what they were saying and the way they were saying it. I think that was a real turning point. We've had enough. We've had enough. You know.
well, I think that the other risk of isolation is our new obsession with cultural imperialism. So recent decisions by the State Department with regard to flying rainbow flags or BLM flags outside of American embassies abroad, I don't think are going to win us a lot of friends. And we've seen a backlash even among the French who are passing laws that disallow the teaching of critical race theory in their schools. And this sort of push, to impose our own liberal norms is certainly it may even backfire in countries that find themselves in sympathy with us normally, and I'm thinking of Poland in particular. So this other project on the soft power side
Yeah.
is going to further isolate us, I think, as well.
Yeah. 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 Well, James, let us sally forth into the weekend. It's been delightful to connect and see you in the flesh, as it were. Right? Uh, very informative listening to you. It always is. And I'll take a sec here to thank those listeners and viewers who've tuned in and stayed with us. Adios.
That's it. Thanks. Always good talking to you, and have a good one.
Yeah. Cheers, man.
All right.
Bye.